In today's video, we're going to talk about criminals posing as police officers and soldiers during SHTF. And we're also going to talk about how to identify the impersonators right after the channel intro. Remember, only you can ensure you and your family's survival. Live your life with honor and integrity, and always be the wolf hunter. Don't be the sheep, and never be the wolf. Welcome. I'm an avid prepper, an oath keeper, and I'm certified to teach the use of deadly force. If you want to learn actual prepping skills and how to protect yourself legally, then please subscribe and also click the bell icon so you won't miss whenever a video is released. We're in this together, so welcome to this community. So subscriber William Cargyle actually asked me about a year ago at how to spot a criminal posing as police or soldiers during the collapse of society. And I'm just now getting around to doing a video on it because I think it's a very valid thing to be concerned about, since there is a high possibility of marauders or criminals posing as people of authority in order to get what they want after SHTF. Let's say you're in a community and a group of armed men approach your community. They identify themselves as law enforcement and they say they're in the area to check out reports of marauders in the area. And they ask if they can stay the night and get some rest before heading back out the next morning to find those marauders. Or let's say you're evacuating a dangerous area and you see a checkpoint manned by armed men in the distance. So let's see how you could possibly quickly tell if you're dealing with actual police officers instead of criminals posing as police. Something that we have to consider for this topic is society in the process of collapsing, or has it been collapsed for some while? And the reason I pose that question is because if society has just collapsed, then cops will probably still have their uniforms and radios and the same type of guns, etc. Basically, uniformity. But if the collapse happened some time ago, then you may have to look for other clues besides uniformity. And we'll get into all of that in just a few moments. But it's also very important to consider that after SHTF, there may not be any such thing as a police officer after the collapse. And here's why. If there's been a true societal collapse, and it's been going on for a while, including the total collapse of the government, then in actuality, there probably won't be any police officers. If there's no government, then there's no police department. And if there's no police departments, then there's no police officers. Then the cop ends up going from being a police officer to a non-police officer. Just to simplify it, graduating a police academy doesn't make someone a police officer. It's being employed by a police department that makes them a cop. Once they've lost that employment by their police department, they're no longer a police officer. Kind of like if a person works at a McDonald's restaurant. While that restaurant is open, then that person can identify themselves as a restaurant employee. But if that McDonald's closes down, and if that person can't find another job at a different restaurant, then he is no longer considered a restaurant employee. So it's the same way with cops. They're only a police officer while they're actually employed at a police department. Once the collapse happens, and once the government shuts down, and once the police department's closed down, then that cop loses his employment and then will no longer legally be a police officer. So in a moment, we'll talk about how to identify an impersonator if the collapse has happened months prior. But right now, we're going to talk about signs to look for if SHTF is just starting to happen or just recently happened. If society is in the process of collapsing or just recently collapsed, many cops will still have uniformity, i.e. the same types of uniforms, the same types of guns, the same types of radios, etc. So if you're confronted with a group of guys claiming to be the police, but they all have different radios and guns and uniforms, then there's a decent chance that they're imposters. Now, one thing I do want to clarify, and that's during disasters that are contained to an area, like the aftermath of a particularly bad hurricane, It's not unusual for police, fire, and paramedic agencies from all over the country to send officers to that area to assist the local police with recovery efforts. So I'm just giving you a heads up that if you have a disaster that has affected your state but not the entire country, then don't be surprised to see teams of police and firefighters and medical personnel from different departments in different states and wearing different uniforms to be descending into areas to help with recovery efforts. But let's say it's a countrywide SHTF situation and it's recently happened. I would be really wary of any group of guys who are identifying themselves as police if they're all wearing different uniforms, or their patches say they're from different areas, and if they all have different firearms, and if they don't have matching radios, etc. Now let me also clarify this. Let's say that I live in Piedmont, Oklahoma. I don't, but let's say I do. So I'm living in Piedmont, Oklahoma when SHTF happens. Now Piedmont is located within Canadian County and also Kingfisher County in Oklahoma. And it's also not far from Oklahoma City. And let's say that SHTF recently happened, and I'm in a small community that's taken steps to protect itself from marauders and looters or whatever. And let's also say that a group of armed guys has came to our community and they have identified themselves as police officers and asked for a place to rest or whatever. In a case like this, it would not surprise me if one or two guys were from the Piedmont Police Department and one or two guys were from the Canadian County Sheriff's Department, and if one or two guys were from the Kingfisher County Sheriff's Department, which of course would mean that they would have different uniforms and maybe different firearms and maybe different radios also. But the big difference here is that even though they'd have different uniforms and such, during SHTF it wouldn't surprise me to see actual police officers from different local agencies to be legitimately working together. But where I'd get immediately nervous is if it's a nationwide SHTF situation and I see a group of guys in police uniforms and I don't recognize any of those uniforms from the regional area or even in my state. That would tell me that there's a good chance that they're impersonators. Something that we have to remember is that people can buy FBI and police shirts online. And we also have to remember that police departments don't make their own uniforms and police patches. Those uniforms and patches get made by uniform making companies, and those companies sometimes get burglarized and uniforms and patches do get stolen and sold on the black market. And let's talk about how the standard police uniform looks for a second. Again, standard police uniforms. Now I'm not talking about SWAT uniforms or some of those specialized squads who may be in blue jeans and just a vest. But the standard police uniform will usually consist of a badge on the chest that's either a pin-on or an embroidered badge, and patches on their shoulders that identify them as police officers in which department they're with. And police officers will also usually wear a duty belt that will hold their handgun and baton, radio, extra ammunition magazines, handcuffs, etc. So if some guy or group is identifying themselves as police to you and you're not seeing any patches or any actual duty belts or anything like that, that would be a huge red flag for me. And of course another thing I would look at would be their haircuts, especially if SHTF was in the process of going down or just recently went down. Cops almost always have the same haircuts, either completely bald or the old high and tight. So if a group of guys are telling you that they're police officers and they all have actual hair on their heads, that would be another huge red flag for me. But let's just say that SHTF has been going on for a while, where your average cop is no longer going to have nice uniforms or the luxury of uniformity. One thing I'd look at is the way they stand. Cops have a tendency to use what's called the interview stance when they talk to somebody that they don't know. The interview stance is a non-threatening stance that offers the cop at least a little protection should a general conversation with an unknown person suddenly turn ugly. When somebody is standing in an interview stance, typically their hands are above their waistline so that they can quickly defend against any sudden strikes. And their body is usually slightly bladed in order to make themselves just a little bit smaller of a target. And usually their dominant foot is a little bit behind and offset from their non-dominant foot. and this gives them just a little bit more stability on their feet should they suddenly get hit or bum rushed or whatever. Anyways, a lot of cops use the stance so much on the job that they have a tendency to unknowingly stand like that anytime they're talking to an unknown person. So that would definitely be something that I would be looking for. Now, I would also look at how they're holding their weapons, especially if they're carrying rifles. Cops have a tendency to take a lot of firearms training, so they're usually comfortable with carrying their weapons around. It's hard for me to verbally describe it, but you can usually tell if somebody is comfortable with having a weapon in their hands when there's no intent to use it. Criminals, on the other hand, they don't usually have rifles slung over their shoulders for hours at a time. Their firearms are usually kept hidden until they go to commit their crime. So they many times don't develop that comfortable look while holding their weapons. So if somebody is obviously not used to having a rifle slung over their shoulder, and if they're awkward with that slung rifle, especially if they don't know how to keep their finger off of the trigger while they're just standing there holding it, and also if they're accidentally flagging their team members, those would all be red flags for me. And of course, the types of weapons they'd have would be something else that I would be looking at. Does one have a sawed-off shotgun? Does the other have an AR-15 and the other have an AK-47? That would also be another red flag for me, because that would tell me that those were scrounged up firearms instead of issued firearms. So I already gave clues to spotting impersonators that were more specific to the time period of the collapse occurring, where officers would still probably be uniformed, and then also to the time period where officers would probably no longer have uniformity. But let's now talk about clues you could watch for at any time during or after the collapse. What kind of verbiage are they using when they talk? Are they using at least a few of the words that cops use regularly? Like, do they use the word vehicle instead of car? Or do they use words like articulate instead of the word said? Or do they use military time? Or are they using any 10 codes or signal codes at all? Or did they say disregard instead of never mind? For example, a cop will many times say something along the lines of, "Hey, disregard that meeting that we had planned for later. I can't make it." Whereas a regular person will normally say, "I have to cancel that meeting." But because cops have to use the radio so much and write reports so much, their work verbiage ends up bleeding into the way they talk all the time. So if a group of guys are identifying themselves as cops, and as I hear them talking amongst themselves, I don't hear any kind of cop lingo, that would just be another red flag for me. And also, I don't know about every state inside of the USA, but I imagine that most states are the same. But my state requires for a cop to carry both a badge and a department photo ID. So I wouldn't just accept somebody's story if they just flashed a badge really fast or only showed me a badge after SHTF. I'd want to see both their badge and their photo ID issued to them from their agency. First, there's just too many types of badges out there that look like police badges. And secondly, there's a lot of police officers out there that collect badges from other agencies. And if SHTF happens and their home gets looted and those badges stolen, there could be a lot of badges floating around out there. So since I've kind of explained the reasoning behind everything, to make it short, if I'm having dealings with a group of guys after SHTF and they're all pretty much uniform, and if they stand and talk like cops, and especially if they have actual police badges and police ID cards with their photos on them, then it's pretty safe to say that you're probably dealing with actual police officers. And even if SHTF has went on for a while, where they're no longer having the luxury of uniformity, they'll still probably have their police picture ID and probably still have the language and mannerisms that most police officers have. But if from the start of SHTF and there's no uniformity among them, and they all have different firearms, and they don't even have radios on their duty belts, I would be really suspicious. Now, I know there's always exceptions to every rule. I know there's always the chance that a group of criminals could have raided a police supply store and somehow got photo IDs made of themselves. But I'm talking about what we'd be more than likely to deal with during SHTF. Now I want to remind everyone that if they see one or two of these tips or clues, that it doesn't automatically mean that they're dealing with an impersonator or a real police officer. Many of the things that I mentioned earlier are red flags and may not be positive proof. So instead of immediately taking action on just one red flag, you may want to take the time, if you can, but take the time to see if you notice more red flags that would start giving more definitive proof. And I have to say that I have never served in the military, so I cannot answer on how to spot criminals posing as military. So, would you subs that are both prior or present military, please comment below on how a regular person would be able to tell a military imposter or not. And also please comment with your thoughts on this subject. Have you ever known anybody that's been arrested for impersonating police? Do you think I've missed any important points on this topic? And also, there's going to be the people who stumble across this video and they're just burning to type something like, all cops will be enslaving people during SHTF, and all cops are going to turn into marauders after SHTF, or I'm just going to automatically shoot any cop that I see after SHTF. If you're that guy, please do me a favor and save your comment for the next time you're on a cop block channel. In my career, I've worked with hundreds of other cops, and by and large, they're patriotic guys who support the Second Amendment and just want to protect their communities. They're not wanting to enslave people, and they're not wanting to pillage from others, etc. Also, while I enjoy making these videos for pennies on the hour, I am wishing to purchase better video and editing equipment that will allow me to make better quality videos for you all without actually putting me into debt to make the videos. So if you have the disposable income, please consider joining my Patreon video channel, where for just $1 a month you'll get early access to videos and also receive special prepper and naturally made gifts from time to time, and other exclusive Patreon member rewards when they become available. To help support our community, please subscribe and hit the like button. Please comment below. Please share this video on social media, and please make sure you have the bell icon hit for notifications of when videos are released. Anyways, folks, if you made it this far, hey, thank you very much for watching, and I pray that you have a good night.